If you spend any time in gender-critical spaces, the ones often labeled TERF, you'll notice something. The focus is almost entirely on females, on women's bodies, women's vulnerabilities, women's historical oppression. The argument is that sex-based rights matter, that female people have specific needs and protections that shouldn't be erased by gender identity. And on that level, they're not wrong, but there's a blind spot. Because if you actually want to understand why the transgender debate has become so explosive, why it generates so much heat, you have to look at males too. Not just as oppressors, not just as a class that benefits from patriarchy, but as a class that contains immense internal hierarchy, from the powerful at the top to the truly disposable at the bottom. The gender-critical framework focuses on women, and that's fine as far as it goes, but it misses the fact that some of the deepest insights into this conflict come from looking at what happens to men who find themselves at the bottom of the male bell curve. Men exist on a bell curve. At the top, you'll have the powerful, the CEOs, politicians, the men who actually run institutions. At the bottom, you have the disposable. Think about who gets sent to war, who dies in workplace accidents, who makes up the vast majority of the prison population, the homeless population, the drug overdose statistics. There's a pattern here. Societies have always had a utilitarian relationship with men. There's a brutal logic to it, one that's often tied to biology. Women carry the next generation. A population can lose a significant number of men and recover. Losing a significant number of women is a demographic death sentence. This isn't a moral judgment, just an observation about how human societies have always functioned. Men are treated as more disposable because, biologically speaking, they are. This disposability expresses itself in specific forms of violence, the kind of violence men inflict on other men, and the kind that's inflicted on men who are perceived as weak, as feminine, as prey. In the American prison system, this dynamic is so well known that it has its own terminology. Vulnerable men, young, slight, perceived as gay, are hyper-visible to predators. They're targeted, violated, discarded. It's a horrific systemic crisis that rarely gets discussed in mainstream feminist spaces. Not because feminists are heartless, but because it's a male problem. It happens to males in male spaces at the hands of other males. This matters for the trans debate because many trans women find themselves positioned exactly here. They are people with male bodies who, for various reasons, are read as vulnerable. They experience the world from the bottom of the male hierarchy, and the word they sometimes use for that experience is rape meat. It's a brutal term, but it describes something very real. The feeling of being seen not as a person, but as prey, as something to be used and discarded. The feeling of having no protection, no sacred value, no feature of humanity calculus working in your favor. When a trans woman brings this experience to gender-critical feminists, the response is often confusion. Why are you telling us this? It's not about women, it's a male problem. And technically they're right. The pattern of violence being described, predator targeting the vulnerable, the logic of disposability, the complete absence of any reproductive stakes, it's a male pattern. It's at the prison yard, the streets, what happens to men at the bottom. There's another reason this framework feels alien to women, and it gets to the heart to why biological sex keeps reasserting itself. Right now, in a post-Roe world, there's an enormous amount of conversation about women's fear of unwanted pregnancy, the ability to control whether and when you become pregnant. What's rarely acknowledged is that the rape meat fear, I'm using quotations, experience is a direct flip side of that fear. Women's fear, and trans men's fear for that matter, is rooted in the fact their bodies can create life. An attacker doesn't just threaten violence, it threatens to use their own biology as a weapon against you. To force your body to do what it's biologically designed to do against your will. That's a unique horror. The fear at the bottom of the male hierarchy is rooted in the opposite biological fact. It's the fear that just because your body cannot create life, you're seen as having no sacred value, no protection, just raw vulnerability. These are two fundamentally different kinds of vulnerability, and they map directly onto biological sex. Part of the answer lies in how fundamentally the relationship between sex and reproduction has changed in modern societies. For most of human history, sex and reproduction were functionally inseparable. People married young, often in their teens or early 20s, and had children shortly thereafter. The vast majority of adults were parents. The vast majority of sexual activity was, whether intended or not, connected to the possibility of creating new life. That's not how we live now. In developed countries, the average age of first marriage is now around 30 for men and women. That means there's a decade or more of adult life, the entire decade of peak sexual activity that is completely decoupled from reproduction. People spend their 20s forming identities, building careers, having relationships, all within a framework where sex is about pleasure and connection, not about making babies. And for many, that extends indefinitely. More people than ever are choosing not to have children at all. When you have a decade or more of adult life where sex has no reproductive function, it becomes possible to think of sex as purely expressive, as a matter of identity rather than biology, as something you choose rather than something you are. This is a material basis for postmodern theories of gender. This is why a sterilized society, a society with low birth rates, delayed marriage, and long pre-reproductive adult phase, is also a society where postmodern gender theories flourish. They're describing the real experience of people living in that phase. But a sterilized society is also a pathologically unhealthy one. Living organisms, societies, cultures, people are meant to reproduce. They're meant to find meaning in building something that outlasts them. And when reproduction is endlessly delayed or foreclosed, something starts to rot.